This is the Comics Alternative, episode 191. Reviews of Dark Knight, a true Batman story, Midnight of the Soul, #1, and The Experts. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, Andy and I are going to be discussing three interesting and very different comics. We're going to begin with Paul Dini and Eduardo Risso's Dark Knight, a true Batman story. Yes, you heard right. We're going to discuss a Batman narrative on the Comics Alternative. After that, we're going to look at Howard Chaykin's Midnight of the Soul, #1. And then we're going to wrap up with Sophie Franz's The Experts. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Now, sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that are a lot more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month, as in every month, they have a load of bundles that you can take advantage of where you get a deeper discount on multiple comics from the same publisher than you would get if you bought those comics individually. And this month, they have their usual bundles from Marvel, DC, including DC Vertigo, and Valiant. So check those out where you can get 50% off, 45 to 50% off of bundles of new comics.
Yeah, and you can always save a lot of money with bundles. Why pay full price? But they have other specials. Check out what they have in store for the month of June. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Well, Andy, here we are, beginning the summer. We're out of classes now, and I guess we have been for a couple of weeks. But I know that both of us are going to Heroes Con, but do you have any other special plans this summer besides that?
Well, I've still got to work. I've got my administrative job, so I'm 8:30 to 5 all summer, which is going to be new to have to deal with that. And then I just found out today that my wife and I are moving into a new house, and that'll be in July. So that's pretty much the summer, Heroes Con and moving.
Wow, so no vacation time at all?
No, not really. I took what vacation time I had coming to me to finish writing the book I just finished writing.
Yeah, and in fact, let's go ahead, and we haven't said anything about this on the Comics Alternative before because things were in the works, but since this book is now listed on Amazon, I know Amazon in the UK, we can go ahead and talk about it. So you want to share with our listeners what this project is?
Well, I've completed a book on autobiographical comics for a new series that Bloomsbury is starting called Bloomsbury Comics Studies series. And so they're going to be kind of textbook type books focused on individual topics in comic studies, and you can probably speak more to that since you are the creator of the series.
Yeah. I was going to say that, I hear that the series editor is a pretty cool guy. But, yeah, this is something that's been in the works for a little while, and the series is going to be starting off with 2 volumes. Andy's is going to be the first on autobiographical comics, and then we have one coming up on superhero comics, and then there are others that are set for future publications. There's one on young readers or children's and teen comics. And in fact, Gwen, one of our co-hosts, is writing that book. And then we're having one pretty soon. We're planning on one for webcomics. And right now I'm currently looking for authors for a few other volumes. So I think this is exciting, but the I guess cherry on the top of the excitement is the fact that, Andy, your volume is going to kick everything off.
Yeah, well, that's a daunting position to be in. On one hand, it's exciting to be in that position. On the other hand, I was realizing as things were going along that I didn't have a model to go by in some cases, and so other people are going to be using, I guess, this book as the model. Right.
So that's both scary and I think exciting at the same time. That you're helping to define, in many ways, what the other books in the series will become.
Right.
Yeah. So look forward to that. And another thing we should tell our listeners is that we know where we're going to be at Heroes Con in a couple of weeks. And what table are we going to be at, Andy?
We're going to be in Artist Alley Table 105. So I guess as you come down the escalator and head to the left side of the convention center, you'll find us over there.
Okay. Can you remember our table number from last year or the general area? Because we were on the left as you're coming off the elevator as well.
Yeah, we were in somewhere around 200 or 300. No, it had to be 300 because, or something like that, 300 or 400 because we were on that left side, but there was some distance between us and the wall, or what is, I guess, going to be this time the 501st Stormtroopers photo area is going to be kind of right behind us, or as I like to call it, the space Nazi celebration.
So that's it. We'll be near the space Nazi celebration.
Yeah, I know people don't like it. The 501st Legion does good things for charity, but they dress up like space Nazis.
Okay. Oh, well, so it should be an interesting con. So we'll be there, table 105. We will also be doing something for the first time. We'll have a few Comics Alternative t-shirts for sale.
Yeah, so if you're a fan of the show and you want to show off how much of a fan you are, you can come by and pick up a t-shirt, and we would be grateful for that.
That'd be great. Yeah, you can show that you have discerning tastes. And Andy, you and I are also going to be on a panel on Sunday at Heroes Con. What is it? What time in the afternoon? Can you remember?
I think 2:30.
2:30. Yeah.
The schedule goes up next week, I think, or the schedule goes up a week before the show.
Okay.
So that'll be there for sure. But it's I think 2:30 on Sunday afternoon, and it is called Canon Reloaded. Andy, who puts together the panels, loves talking about the canon, the comics canon, or if there is one. And so he's put together a panel of scholars, teachers, historians, and publishers, I guess, and librarian. So it'll be you and me. It'll be Craig Fisher, Craig Yo, Tom Heinges, and then somebody else I'm not sure of, a librarian, librarian.
So Fisher is going to be on it, because I thought he was, but then we got an email the other day. I didn't see his name on it.
Oh, maybe he isn't.
Oh, okay. Well, that should be fun. I'm looking forward to that.
Yep.
So if you're in the area and you're at Heroes Con, not only can you come by and see us at Table 105, but also you can come on Sunday to the panel.
That's right.
But Andy, we've got other things to discuss well before that, including this week's titles. And let's begin with the first book, and this is Paul Dini and Eduardo Risso's Dark Knight, a true Batman story, published by Vertigo.
Yeah, so I was really grateful when I said I would come back to do the episode after 18 months of working on a book about autobiographical comics and having the very last thing I wanted to do was read another fucking autobiographical comic. And you emailed me and said, well, we're getting copies of The Dark Knight by Paul Dini. Do you want to do that? I'm like, oh. So if you hear like, I don't know, me shooting myself in the head while this is going on, that's because I just can't take another autobiographical comic.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a place to start. Your misery. And but, since you have been immersed in autobiographical comics for quite a while now, how would you place Dark Knight? And by the way, this is Dark Knight, Night, not Knight.
Right.
How would you place this within the stuff that you've been reading for a while?
Well, it is an interesting kind of companion piece to an earlier Vertigo autobiographical graphic novel, Steven Seagal, and I think it was Teddy Christensen who did the art on It's a Bird, which was about things that were going on in Steven Seagal's life while he was writing Superman, and so Dark Knight, a true Batman story, is about Paul Dini's experience, mainly his experience while working on the Batman animated series, and more specifically the Batman animated movie, The Mask of the Phantasm, and he was mugged and beaten severely during this time and took a while to recover. And so the idea of writing Batman while being the victim of a crime that, Batman, if he existed, would have or could have intervened in, is the main thrust of this book. Now, how does it compare or fit within the world of autobiographical comics? Well, I mean, it's interesting because, first of all, a lot of autobiographical comics, the vast majority, are written and drawn by the same creator. Mm-hmm. And so this one, Dini writes with Eduardo Risso, again, which was the case also, with It's a Bird. And so there's something worth, I think, commenting on about that collaboration that goes on here. And I don't know, as in terms of like kind of the quality of the book in relationship to other autobiographical comics, well, it does have some issues, but it's a good read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is based around that mugging that you mentioned that took place during that time. And what year was he working on the animated series? So how long ago was the mugging, in other words?
Oh, I don't know. I can't remember when Mask of the Phantasm came out. And it doesn't, I don't think it specifies a lot of dates in the book.
Mm. But would this be like around the 1980s?
Maybe.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't think the dates are that important to pin down. But it's worth noting in terms of time that one of the things for me that stands out with this book is the kind of back and forth we get and the way that Dini, along with the art of Risso, represents a shift in time from the present to the past. I don't think it's overly complex or difficult at all. I think it's fairly seamless, the back and forth in terms of time shifts. But I do enjoy the way, or I do appreciate the way that we have the narrative frame set up. Because when the story begins, we see a one-page image, which is basically a flashback to Dini being in the hospital, and he's all wrapped up. He has a handle on the side of his head to keep him from rolling over, and he says it makes him look like the Kool-Aid Man. But then we turn the page and we see, for all practical purposes, we're in present time, or the time of the narration, where Dini is talking to someone, but we're not entirely sure. He starts telling his story. We see, though, that whomever he's talking to is also video recording him, because he's standing in front of a board, and we can see in the foreground a camera that is turned to him. Of course, the image that we see on the camera screen is actually Batman and not Dini. But there is someone responding to him. And so we have Dini here narrating the story, and there is this back and forth where we will see him in the present moment, or the present moment of narration. But then we go back to times where he is younger. He's telling the story about what happened to him and the aftermath. And then his story is interspersed with fantasies that are generated. I mean, basically characters from the Batman family, both Batman as well as, in fact, primarily the villains that he fights.
Yeah, so that present day framing sequence punctuates this narrative throughout, and in it, Dini, again, as you said, speaking to the camera, will hold up a drawing and put it on a board that's behind him, which is basically the kind of procedure for storyboarding or laying out the action of the animated movie, like what he's working on. And so he'll hold up a picture, for example, that's meant to be his younger self as a child, and that goes up on the board. And as the novel progresses, as the graphic novel progresses, the board gets more and more full. And you mentioned too some of these time shifts, and that is one of the more interesting things. And I think this gets us to Risso's art in here. So I really found that Eduardo Risso was, this for readers who are used to his art on, say, 100 Bullets and the other stuff he's done like that, might be really surprised by this book. Because his art is, I think, dramatically different. It's still recognizably him, but for example, the art in the present period, this narrative present, is much more realistic, almost kind of photorealistic in a way that his art normally isn't. And then he shifts around in different styles to indicate different time periods, or different settings, or even different moods. And so I was really impressed. In fact, the thing that impressed me the most about this book was Risso's art.
Really? Yeah. I agree that for those who are, let's say, big fans of 100 Bullets is probably the best example. If you didn't know that Risso was the artist of this book, and you picked it up and started flipping through, it may not immediately occur to you that Risso is the artist, for the reasons that you mentioned. But because that's the experience that I had. I mean, I knew he was the artist, but when I got the book and started flipping through it, I thought, this is a very different kind of Risso that at least I'm used to. But I started reading it, and there are those moments, though, that do strike me as distinctly Eduardo Risso. Again, especially as we see in, Spaceman, but especially 100 Bullets. And this may be a way of getting to something that you alluded to earlier, and that is the curious relationship here we have between writer and artist in telling an autobiographical story. I want to start with a couple of pages. This is 34 and 35, when Dini is telling us about a series of therapists that he has seen over the years. And he introduces this on page 33. He says, living alone as I did for so long, I reserved most of my emotional affirmation for my therapist. There had been a few of them by that time. And so we see, headshots of various individuals we assume are his various therapists. And then we turn the page and we see what appears to be, at least at this point in the narrative, his most recent one. It's a woman, and he is in her office. They're drinking tea or coffee. The way that Risso draws her, this is the reason why I wanted to bring up this as an example. You're right. This is not exactly the kind of art that we usually see in Risso illustrated comics. But the way that Risso draws the therapist had me wondering what was going on with this scene and why really this scene was here. And what I mean by that is, if you know his work from 100 Bullets, the way that Risso would draw women, very, very sexy, very alluring, very revealing. And it makes sense given the noir nature of that title. And we've seen this other places as well. It's not just 100 Bullets. Brother Lano, we saw it, definitely. Now, the way he's drawing the therapist here with her low-cut dress, and we have at the top panel on page 35 a close-up of her legs, I wondered, is there something going on here with this therapist and Dini that is unspoken? I don't think that there is, or at least I didn't get anything after this scene, but I kind of wondered why sexualize the therapist in this way. Maybe his therapist was extremely sexy and had a low-cut dress and shapely legs. Who knows? But it when I saw that, I thought, okay, that's the kind of Risso that I'm used to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was, the way I looked at that when I read it, I had thoughts about it. One of Dini's major contributions to Batman was the creation of the character Harley Quinn.
Right. And
Harley Quinn, as Harleen Quinzel, was a therapist. And so I was wondering if we weren't seeing here some of the kind of origins of that character. Now he does point out later on that he has a friend, one who kind of supports him and helps him after the mugging, who is also the model who was the model for Harley Quinn.
Right.
But the idea of a therapist who falls in love with her patient, which is basically the origin of Harley Quinn, could easily have stemmed from this type of relationship. So I don't imagine, when Dini was, putting together the script, that, the image, for example, on page 35 at the top, where we get the close-up of her legs and the way she's playing with her shoe, that I would imagine that was in the script.
Okay.
So whatever Dini wanted to, whatever the kind of sexualization of the therapist that's going on here is I would guess something that Dini cued in the script. But you're right in that there's no other kind of discussion of it. It is really, really subtextual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you pointed out that friend that we see who was, the inspiration for Harley. And, she definitely isn't sexualized, at least in the same ways. Another example, probably even a better example of Risso's art being the kind of recognizable type of illustration, the style that we're used to, occurs later on, about 10, 12 pages later, when there's a recounting of the actual mugging itself.
Yeah.
And this begins on, pages 44 and 45, and then we turn to 46, 47, 48, 49, and we see the mugging taking place. Now, this looks like something straight out of 100 Bullets.
Right, and there is a noticeable shift because the scene right before that, Dini is on his date with the actress who, he's trying to impress and who isn't really impressed with him.
Right.
And so when we shift into the time in which the crime is about to take place, it is interesting that then Risso's more heavy ink, 100 Bullets style shows up, and so that is one of the more dramatic stylistic changes in the book.
Exactly, and in fact, it's really interesting how we get to that, the heavy ink style of let's call it just recognizably, Risso, because right before that we get Dini on a date with this, vapid actress that he's trying to impress. And the art style, while recognizable, it's using a different color palette. And then we shift to, again, a more current time of narration, which looks almost more realistic, as you pointed out, but also it seems to have more in common with maybe watercolors. And then from there we transition into the mugging, which, again, seems to be something that could be straight out of 100 Bullets. And the way that he shows the crime, the way that he draws the violence, and even the way that he represents the muggers, two African Americans, again, just strike me as something that we've seen many times before.
Oh, yeah.
So, for instance, on page 49, I think is a great example of this, is when we see the two muggers. One's in a hoodie, and all we see are his eyes, right? The face is completely black. And then the other one, this is that top panel, or embedded panels on page 49, we see that his face is almost completely in shadow underneath the New York cap, and we see his eyes and teeth. And again, this is something that we're very much used to from 100 Bullets. Did you see any issues in the representation of the muggers in this scene?
Well, it's an interesting issue because Dini acknowledges that that they are African American, and that is a problem to represent, to be stereotyping here. And even as he's narrating, the moments that lead to his attack, the reason why he keeps walking towards these guys and doesn't, turn around and go in a different direction, which he of course regrets later, is because he doesn't want to look like a racist.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, this really happened, if this really happened this way, Dini is bound to that, the reality of that experience, but, it does raise issues of stereotype and representation.
Right. And because I was curious what you thought of that, because it strikes me that someone who's unfamiliar with Risso's art can read this scene and they may see something more racist than definitely that was intended, and perhaps than you and I would pick up on, because they're looking at the mugging, and we see the characters as I described, completely black-faced, literally, their faces under shade, and in that one especially, where all we see for the most part are the white eyes and the white teeth, now that strikes me as something that could be seen as a racist, or something resembling a racist caricature, right? With the big lips and the wide white eyes. But if you know Risso's art, and again, 100 Bullets is a clear example of this. That's the way he represents many individuals, especially those who are a little on the shady or violent side, regardless of race. So I don't think that it is a stylistic element of Risso's that is inherently problematic when it comes to representations of race and ethnicity. I think this is just part of his style. But in this context, and if someone is unfamiliar with the work of Risso, I can see where they could see this as a little uncomfortable.
But I think that it is even. I think as much as I like 100 Bullets, I think both Azzarello and Risso have issues with the way they represent a lot of different racial groups in that series. Azzarello writes in a very heavily racialized dialogue, and Risso's art tends to match that. So, I think that, does it let somebody off the hook to say, well, you're just not familiar with this artist's work in other things to have a reaction to this particular book? I think people are going to a lot of people are going to come to this book without having read 100 Bullets, and so I do think it's an issue. It's one, however, that to some degree Dini does foreground his own uncomfortableness with this representation.
Right, and the complexity surrounding his feelings of this. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. And, in fact, I don't want you to get the impression that I'm trying to, delegitimize someone's experience. If they're unfamiliar with Risso's art, they see this, and saying, oh, it's not really racist if you actually knew his work. Because I think if you look at Risso's work in a larger sense, then you can see where some of the potential racism there, some of this, maybe quite a bit of the sting is taken out. However, you can't count on that context, right, when someone comes to an individual text. So someone looking at this within only the context of Dark Knight and this story, can understandably see this as maybe perpetuating certain visual stereotypes of African Americans. Despite what Dini says as a way of contextualizing this mugging. And so the creators, have to understand this, that, as you pointed out, people who are coming to this, many of them may not know the work of either Risso or Dini outside of this. So that's something that they're going to have to take into account. I don't think that it makes this book, I don't think it undermines the story. It's just one of those issues, maybe along with the sexualization of the therapist, that caused me to pause. Mm-hmm. It took me momentarily out of the story because I got to wondering about that. And I have no problem with pausing in a story and trying to wrestle with how I feel or think about something that's being represented. But it does take you out of the story.
Okay. My issues that I had when I was reading a story, one of them was that I felt like the book gets a little unwieldy, and a large part of that is the beginning of the book. Dini spends about the first 20 pages or so dealing with his childhood. And it's during those scenes that we get some of the more interesting experiments that Risso tries. Dini describes himself as an invisible child, and so Risso draws the young Paul in black and white, and in a different style than all the other kids. Mm-hmm. And so I thought those things were really clever and interesting in terms of style. But as I read through the book, I really did not feel like that that information about his childhood really was relevant in relationship to the main story, which is what happens to Paul when he gets mugged and goes through a difficult recovery. And and in fact, one of the things I would like to have seen fleshed out more in that in the latter half of the book is Dini's self-destructive tendencies. There's a really striking scene at one point where he takes an Emmy that he's won and cuts himself with it, quite a bit. Cuts his chest and stomach with it, and that idea that he has that tendency, we don't really see much setting up where that comes from. It just kind of is, is a part of his personality. And so if those childhood sections were maybe to deal with that more, if that was in fact a part of his childhood, I would find them more relevant. But at the point, basically, it seems like the point of the childhood sections is to say he was an outcast. He was a kid who lived within his imagination, and he became connected to characters like Batman and Superman through that combination of his outcast status and his living in his imagination. But I don't know if that's necessary for the rest of the book.
Yeah, that part toward the end where he cuts himself quite a bit with the Emmy. I found that was one of the more striking parts of this story, especially in the second half. And I was a little surprised that there wasn't more done with that. He references it a little later on, but again, it's almost in passing. So now I read the early part where we have the background of, him growing up and not fitting in and all of that. In one way you can see this as kind of a classic nerd context, right? So,
right.
The guy who's the comic nerd, this is how he becomes the comic nerd. Within the context, though, of what happens later when he isolates himself and then cuts himself, you mentioned, with the Emmy. I just saw that as a setup and a way to understand how this sense of being an outsider leads to a kind of self-centered isolation that eventually, especially after the mugging, leads him to retreat to the point that he becomes so self-destructive. In other words, I was seeing a clear link, or a clear-ish link, between the way that he grew up and the way that he ended up, kind of screwing himself up in many ways after the mugging. Now, I don't know if that larger message was intended at all, or if it's as overt as it probably could be. But that made sense to me. That the early stuff at the beginning, with him not fitting in, being at school, and the way that Risso draws that, I agree. That's quite effective. I saw that as kind of connected some of the stuff that goes on toward the end with the self-destruction.
That makes some sense to me in that. That would also explain then things like his relationship with this actress who he's trying to impress, and the fact that she's only interested in him really because he works for or has worked for Amblin Entertainment, which is run by Steven Spielberg, and she's thinking he can be her connection to Steven Spielberg. That the kind of stereotypical nerd outsider would be making decisions in his life to try to get this actress who's really got nothing to offer him except her looks, and try to impress her. That he would go out of his way, which ends up being, of course, part of his downfall, because the mugging happens for a variety of reasons, one of which is because he pretends to be going somewhere else after her date to make her think that he's going to see another woman. So he's not even heading to his own house or his own apartment when he's mugged. He is, engaged in this poorly thought out subterfuge.
It's really interesting as we were talking about this. I was flipping through toward the back, and I do see, and this is around pages 116, 117, and especially 118, where we get him with his therapist again. This is after the mugging. He's, recovering from the accident. Now, if you look toward the last part of 118, that Risso and Dini do link the therapist with Harley Quinn. And I had forgotten about that until I just saw it flipping through. I don't think it's an overt connection, but at least there is that kind of visual link between the two. Where we see, especially in that last panel at the very bottom, we're obviously seeing things through the lens of Dini as he's looking at his therapist. He's also seeing Harley there, who says, "I'm glad you got your sense of humor back for a while there. You were sounding like a real drag."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I had forgotten that too. So you're right there. So that makes me sound smarter than I actually was. So great. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah, that's what I'm here for. Okay, now here's a question, maybe as a way of wrapping up, kind of allude to where we began with me asking, Mr. Expert on autobiographical comics a question about this. Now, if you were teaching a course, a brand new course on autobiography and comics, would you include Dark Knight as an example? Potentially.
Probably not. No. I don't want to be, overtly critical of the book. I do think that there's a lot worth talking about here. There's a lot going on. I don't feel like parts of it really gelled for me the way I would have liked them to, and I think that there are other works that do things well. Now, I might show pages from this, because I think, again, what I think is the best part of the book is Risso's art, and the way he shifts styles throughout the book is really remarkable. And so I would use this, maybe show some of this as an example of how art can be used in a comic to indicate not only time shifts, but shifts in mood and shifts in types of scenes that are taking place, and so on. One other thing I wanted to mention, though, was when I brought up the Emmy scene where he cuts himself in the Emmy. I don't want to fixate on this too much, but have you ever seen an Emmy in real life?
I have not.
I had a student who had won an Emmy one point in time, and he brought it to class and showed it to me, and I was scared of it. It does look like it could do some serious damage. So when he starts slicing up his stomach and chest with it, I was like, yeah, and Emmy would do that. But,
yeah, and there's something – I've always thought that there's something kind of fascistic looking about the Emmy Award, And then with those pointed wings?
Yeah.
That kind of underscores the Nazi-ness of that.
Yeah, and I was just reminded, I don't know if when you said what about the student getting an Emmy, I was reminded of, I don't remember the Saturday Night Live sketch when Susan Lucci hosted, and there was she had that notorious situation where she'd been nominated for an Emmy, for a daytime Emmy, for 20 years and never won or whatever. And everybody on the set has an Emmy that they've won. Like the guy, there's a guy fixing the lights, and he's using his Emmy as a wrench on the lights because it's so easy to get an Emmy. So I don't want to say it's easy. I don't want to anybody listening who has an Emmy or has been nominated for an Emmy and hasn't gotten it, that it's really easy to get an Emmy. But I did have a student who had an Emmy.
Did that student pass your class?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. But he was a little too proud of the fact that he had won an Emmy.
Oh, okay.
Again, no offense to anybody.
Okay, well let's move on to the next title that we're going to look at, and this is Howard Chaykin's Midnight of the Soul. This is the first of 5-issue limited series from Image. And this is going to be released, in fact, the day that this episode goes up, which is June 8th.
That's right. And Midnight of the Soul is a book that has long been a kind of dream project of Chaykin's. I know in reading interviews going back quite a while, and some of these interviews are in the book Howard Chaykin Conversations that Brandon Costello edited for University of Mississippi Press. So he's had this as a project. Chaykin has had this as a project he's wanted to work on for a long time. So people who are Chaykin fans have probably been hearing of Midnight of the Soul for a while now, and looking forward to it coming out. And just to give a kind of synopsis of it, the main character, Joel, is a World War II veteran. He was there when at the liberation of the concentration camps, and so he saw personally the horrors of what had happened, and this basically wrecks him. He goes back to civilian life and really can't function. He's, at the time we see him, he's trying to be a writer. He seems to be writing some kind of
an alternate history.
Alternate history, yeah. I was thinking of something like Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle,
right? Yeah,
or something where the Nazis have won World War II, and but he's not having any success as a writer, and meanwhile his marriage is crumbling, and he basically drinks himself into a coma every day.
Yeah. And you mentioned how he's damaged after or because of the war, and I mean but it's not only psychological, but he is wounded. So he goes to the hospital for that, but also because of the psychiatric problems. And so that's where basically we find Joel here. Now, one of the things I'm curious, and Andy, you know a lot more about Chaykin than I do, and in fact, you and I have even teased the possibility of doing a future episode, a creator spotlight on Chaykin, which I would love to do at some point later. But let me ask you, if this is a project that Chaykin has wanted to do for some time, what do you think may have been holding him back? Was he just, waiting for the story to form itself more? Was he waiting for the right publisher? What?
That's a good question. When we had Matt Fraction on a while ago, and Matt was talking about collaborating with Chaykin on Satellite Sam, he pointed out that Chaykin has a real working class mentality when it comes to doing comics, and so he takes on projects that are kind of work for hire projects, because he wants to constantly be working, and so I would think so. So this is just me speculating. I think it was more of a matter of timing. Satellite Sam has ended. Its first volume, at least. There's a plan for the next volume, and we haven't seen anything actually from Chaykin in a little while. So not a huge amount of time, but a little while. So I'm guessing that the kind of confluence of timing as far as work was concerned, but also I think also there's been a lot of with Fraction doing Satellite Sam with Chaykin was itself a real celebration of Chaykin's work and his history, and Fraction really did play to Chaykin's strengths, and so there may have been some kind of inspiration to do this now rather than keep waiting for it there. Again, all this is me speculating. I don't want to say what's going on inside Howard Chaykin's head, but it does seem like that. And whatever's going on in Howard Chaykin's head, someone's getting a blowjob.
Well, and on the topic of blowjob, and it reminded me that, unless I'm forgetting something, the last time I remember seeing something from Chaykin, especially something that he both drew and wrote, was Black Kiss XXXmas special from a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I can't remember if that he did that Buck Rogers series for Hermes Press.
Right, I think that was before then.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not really remembering the timing on those things, but so there's those.
Because I remember that I think it was originally supposed to come out during Christmas because it was going to be a Christmas special. Then it was about 6 months late, so they called it Christmas in July.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I don't know, what did you think of that?
Black Kiss. I'll keep buying Black Kiss. It is really over the top, and that I would have to say too with Midnight of the Soul in relation to Black Kiss. This isn't the first time Chaykin's had a character get murdered while receiving, being on the receiving end of oral sex.
Right. Yeah, and this is what happens toward the end of this first issue, and this is, as you point out, kind of typical Howard Chaykin. As I was reading this, I didn't know exactly what would happen, but just maybe a third of the way in, not quite half of the way in, I expected something like this to happen when we are first introduced to Joel's wife, Patricia, because this is after the flashback, and we see that Joel is, trying to write this alternate history. He's unsuccessful, and then Patricia is yelling at him to, just quit drinking because he's at a typewriter. He has a bottle of liquor right there, right next to him. And she says, "Why don't you do something?" He says, "I am doing something. I'm trying to draw, or I'm trying to write this novel." She says, "It's not working. No one's accepting it." And so she makes a comment about being a court reporter, and she's the only one who's bringing in the money. Now, when I was reading these pages, she said she's a court reporter, so she's a working class person, right? The way she's dressed, with the tight dress, and we see the stockings with the line down the back of the leg with the high heels, I'm thinking a couple of things. One, okay, this is Howard Chaykin, and this is a Howard Chaykin woman, but also there's something much more sexual that's going to happen if I turn a few more pages. And lo and behold, as you mentioned, someone getting whacked while they're getting a BJ.
Yeah, so that actually raises another issue, which is that as this is a kind of long time gestating project for Chaykin, it is also a very, very Chaykin-esque book in that the beats that it hits are not unfamiliar to anybody who's read a lot of Howard Chaykin before. There are, it takes place in the 1950s. There's issues with, an interracial relationship. The Joel's wife is a ball buster. She's not the first ball busting wife in a Howard Chaykin book. And it almost feels like there's a kind of shorthand going on here for people who Chaykin. Okay, here's the hero, the haunted hero with a past, who looks like every other Howard Chaykin hero. Here's the ball busting wife. Here's some 1950s racism or whatever, some period racism. And and a lot of language and sexual content. So fans of Chaykin's will kind of see some kind of familiarity with this. Now, where it ends up, with Joel finding out what his wife's job really is, going on, planning on going after her, but having her already being in a predicament of her own when Joel heads out for his revenge. We're gonna kind of see where this is going in this first issue. So, if this does end up being a kind of culmination of a lot of different themes and ideas and plot elements that Chaykin has used before, I'm kind of fine with that when we get to the end, and maybe Chaykin fans will be surprised by where it goes.
Yeah, you mentioned the Chaykin beats here, and I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I saw that. Along with that, I like where this first issue went. I think that it does a great job of setting up this story. It leaves us at a good place in anticipating what happens next. So I really like the way that he has paced things. Also in terms of beats, I'm thinking of the word pattern, and that's another thing that struck me with the way that Chaykin is structuring this first issue, and I'm wondering if he'll do something similar in the subsequent 4 issues. And, that is, he uses both in terms of paneling on each page, as well as certain images within the panels, a particular pattern as a way of binding the story together. Mm-hmm. I mean, even the very theme or I guess the subject matter of Joel's introduction to who he is. We see on the first page, in that first panel, the word parallels. And he says, ever since I was a kid, I've been obsessed with parallels. I can't say why exactly. When I made the mistake of mentioning to the army therapist, he came back with more bullshit about a need to impose order on a disordered universe. But who knows? Mm-hmm. And then we see a series of pages that have these elongated panels that, the panels are parallel one to the other, but the images within the panels all show something where there are parallel lines in some form or another, right? Mm-hmm. Along with that, we also find a similar kind of paralleling of pattern later on in the story with circles. And we even anticipate some of this, I think, early on with those opening pages, because many of these panels are very circle heavy. We see this later on with the circles when Joel is putting on the record, and right before he discovers what his wife is really doing. And so we see a series of patterns where circles are prominent: the circle of the record, the circle of the television screen, the circle of him on a motorcycle going, making donuts right before he heads out. So, there's that. And also there's parallel in that, and we're looking at a PDF of this comic, but I don't think that there are page numbers on the actual comic when it comes out. But what would be the second and the third page of the finished comic, those pages are repeated in the fourth to the last and the third to the last pages of the comic. So there's a kind of paralleling or a closure going on there as well. And I really did enjoy the kind of pattern that Chaykin is establishing with his first issue. And I'm curious if he's going to do something similar in the others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting that to point out that there's a lot of kind of visual stuff going on. Now that what I like about that, what you're talking about there, is an aspect of Chaykin's work that I've often enjoyed, and this goes back to American Flag, which is the way he kind of embeds information in the story that doesn't become apparent until later on. So I'm guessing that you're picking up something with this idea of parallels, this theme that is going to become, important later. And I remember reading American Flag #1, and there's a scene in which, when we're first introduced to Reuben Flagg, he's fallen asleep on a moving walkway. He's fallen asleep standing up, and he ends up bumping into a diplomat who spills a bunch of papers, and we get a kind of little glance at some of the papers, and we don't realize until, maybe I think almost a year into the series why those papers were important. Mm-hmm. And so if you hadn't been paying attention or rereading, you wouldn't have caught those little hints and foreshadowing. So I'm hoping that with this that Chaykin is using that level of narrative complexity again.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I can see the hints of this here. I mean, I think it's fairly easy enough to anticipate some of the paralleling thematically that will be going on later, especially when we see what happens to Patricia, the situation she's in, and what he's about to do when he discovers, or after he discovers, those photographs that she has hidden away, that there are parallel events taking place. So, at what point will the two lines converge? I'm assuming that they'll converge, but right. I mean, that in itself is thematic paralleling. So I enjoyed that, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how this wraps up. And I hope that this turns out to be an actual monthly series where there are no long delays. I mean, do you know if this is going to come out monthly, or is it going to be every other month? I don't remember in the latest previews seeing subsequent issues, but maybe I just haven't paid attention.
I'm not sure. I was assuming it was going to continue coming up. Yeah, I mean the latest issue of previews has issue 3.
Okay,
listed,
so then I guess it will be on time.
Yeah. Well, it's scheduled to be on time anyway. Yeah. And Chaykin's pretty good with deadlines. Yeah. So I'm not going to be too worried about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I like this.
Yeah, it's I'm on the hook for Chaykin no matter what. I do understand his issues, and there are these kind of common things that show up in his work, and it is what it is. It may not be for everybody, but I'm, like I said, on the hook for it. Mm-hmm.
Andy, let's look at the last title that we're discussing this week, and this is The Experts by Sophie Franz. This is published by Retrofit Big Planet, and this came out in very late April. Were you familiar with anything from Franz before this book?
I don't think so. Were you?
No, and in fact, I was looking to see if she's published something else that I may have read or at least looked at some point. I don't think so. I was looking through her website, which she calls Baloney Feathers, and if you want to check it out, it's sophiefranz.com. So SOPHIEFRANZ.com. And, it has some of her other art. She's done a number of things in small publications, maybe collections, but nothing that I recognize, nothing that I think that I've seen before. So this is my first exposure to Franz's comics.
Okay.
And this is a short story. I can't remember how many pages this is. It's almost like a mini comic in terms of its dimensions, although it's not a mini comic. But this is something that we've come to expect from Retrofit Big Planet, right? Where they experiment around with different dimensions and different formats in terms of the comics they put out. And this, I'm not even sure of the inches in terms of dimension, but but it's something like a larger mini comic would be a good way of describing this. And it's a story where we have three individuals. Arguably four if you consider the dog an individual. So it's Tracy who's the narrator, Sharon, Frankie, and the dog is called the Colonel. And the reason why you could arguably consider him a quote-unquote person is that apparently he understands French. He doesn't speak it, but he understands French. And these characters are out on some kind of platform or station. It looks quite elaborate. Basically what it looks like is a nice, modernish looking home on a body of water. And we don't know exactly where or what body of water this is. We don't even know if it's the world that we all live in, or I'm assuming that most of our listeners live in. We don't know why they're there, except for the fact that they're there to record some of the stuff that's going on around them. And some of the things that are going on around them is that these creatures are every now and again surfacing from the water and observing them and in various ways kind of interacting, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, with these characters. And they're aquatic creatures of some kind. They're humanoid, but there's also something fish-like about them as well. We don't know much about them. We don't know much about what caused them. There's something about this story that strikes me as almost post-apocalyptic, but maybe not. There's something that's happened, and there's something that's going on because of the context. But we're not entirely sure of a better way of putting it, there's really no exposition whatsoever. But I think that works really well in this story. We're kind of thrown into it. It enhances the mystery, and it makes what happens in this story even more creepy.
Right. And on top of it, not only do we not know anything, the characters don't know anything.
Right.
They don't remember exactly what they're supposed to be doing in this station. They don't remember how things got the way they are, and they don't remember how, for example, the one character how he came to have a head of a fish, Frankie, or even how what. And they send the dog out. The dog goes and gets supplies. The dog goes out on a boat on his own. Goes and gets supplies and comes back, and the supplies seem to be kind of fairly random things. They don't generally get what they ask for, and they're really sick of the diet that they're on. But there seems to be something going on where their memory is fading, and the way I thought of it when I got to the end of this book, and I really liked the experts. Is it felt to me like a Beckett play.
Oh, It's funny. I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
Wow, great minds think alike.
A little Waiting for Godot, but it also, when you mentioned it may be a post-apocalyptic world, it may not. That is that kind of like mysterious, unfamiliar landscape that and almost like kind of dream landscape that's a part of Beckett's writing. It had that feeling, and it had that feeling in a really good way. This brought out to me a lot of the things I like the most about reading Beckett is that kind of level of uncertainty. I'm fine with, and in fact, it's kind of fun to read a book that so actively resists explaining itself.
Right. You mentioned Beckett. I was thinking the exact same thing. And I was also thinking that if this were a kind of tale that was told in a more realistic setting, maybe Edward Albee would be a better example. But what both of those dramatists have in common is, they're known for their absurdist art, right? So
right.
We have characters who are in certain situations. They don't know why. They don't understand why. they're trying to make sense of things, but they're kind of okay with things not making very much sense. In a way that doesn't make sense to the viewer or the reader. And when we talk about the characters here, especially the narrator, Tracy, who points out that she can't remember, or none of them can remember, really the specifics of, let's say, how Frankie turned into a fish, or at least his head looks, fish-like, or the exact context behind Sharon's missing finger because it was bitten by these creatures, but they don't know exactly everything behind that event. And she says at one point in this story that she says, quote, "It's hard to hold anything in my head for more than a few seconds, hard to focus. Words don't make sense, don't hold still. They slide away from where I'm looking, morphing, visible only in my periphery." And I think that's a great way of explaining what something like, let's say, a Beckett or an Albee play is all about.
Yeah.
And then this is compounded by the fact, or underscored, I guess, by the fact that there seems to be a fog that has drifted into a literal fog that's drifted over their dwelling. And, we can see the fog, I guess, somewhat in the comic. It can't be too foggy, of course, because then it would be very difficult to make certain things out. But the literal fog that they're in is, very similar to the metaphoric fog that they're in, because they don't know certain things, they can't remember details or why things have turned out the way that they have. And so I think that works brilliantly in this story. And then it brings us to kind of the very end of this, which is, again, very absurdist. I think that Frankie says this at the very end. He says, "What kind of experts are we who don't even know what we're doing here?" Mm-hmm. That could be like straight out of Beckett.
Yeah. And that what you said about I like the passage you quoted about language, and that kind of slipperiness of language is, exactly why, post-structuralists loved Beckett. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, in fact, when I got done with this, I thought, what would it be like to adapt this comic into a stage play? And it wouldn't take much because the setting is so limited.
Right. Yeah. You're right. This could be done because of the sparse setting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if Sophie Franz were up for it, put that on.
Yeah. So yeah, Sophie, if you're listening to this and you don't already have plans to turn this into a play, we think that would be a great project, and we'd go see it.
Yeah.
And there is something very spooky about these aquatic creatures. They have what looks like little whisker things coming down from the side of their face. Their mouth really doesn't look completely like a humanoid mouth. And at one point, they bite the hand of one of the experts, Sharon. Mm-hmm. And so we see in one illustration, the pages aren't numbered, but there's one page where we see a drawing, which looks to be like Tracy's drawing, of Sharon's finger. She even labels it, where Sharon's finger was. This is Sharon's hand. But then it looks like water, although it's probably not. It's some kind of mark or stain of some sort underneath the finger that has been bitten off. And Tracy writes, "Who the hell knows what this is?" And so there's something on Sharon's hand that is there, some kind of stain, if you will, that's the result probably of it being bitten by one of these creatures who we don't know, what these creatures are. And maybe this stain or whatever it is has some kind of link to what Sharon does toward the end of the story, which we won't give away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I really like the experts. I mean, this is going in my, in my pile for things I'm going to remember at the end of the year.
Yeah, I'm the same way. And I was also wanting to say, and I'll say it now, that it would not surprise me at all if this was nominated for an Eisner next year.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, and it definitely should. Because this is the kind of thing that I think would really resonate with the kind of judges that we're familiar with.
Yeah, that's true.
So, both of us strongly recommend Sophie Franz's The Experts, that has come out about a month or so ago from Retrofit Big Planet. You can always count on great stuff coming from Retrofit Big Planet.
Yeah, that's true. I it is definitely a company that is very consistent in its quality, and I was just going through as I was cleaning out my office a little bit today, which is a daunting task, and going through, and it part of what delayed me was I found a big stack of Big Planet Retrofit comics that we had covered it in the past, especially on our publisher spotlight, and it caused me to kind of linger and go, oh yeah, I really like these.
Yeah, they're definitely a publisher to check out, both in terms of this specific title, the Experts, but also all of their output.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we would recommend that our listeners take a look at all the titles that we discussed this week. We started off with Paul Dini and Eduardo Risso's Dark Knight, a true Batman story. After that, we looked at the first issue of Howard Chaykin's Midnight of the Soul, and then we wrapped up with The Experts.
Yep.
Yeah. A lot of good titles.
It was a good week, and I forgive you for making me read another autobiographical comic.
Okay. So I'm not on your shit list.
Not for that.
Okay. For the other things. But, if you want to find great titles like this, then you should go to the website of our sponsor for the Comics Alternative, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to dcbservice.com, you're going to find some great deals, monthly specials, but whatever they are, you can always count on great discounts. And after you do get comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe, which is a really simple and easy-to-use plugin. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
Or you can get a hold of us through Twitter, where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to the blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right, but we're all over social media, so you can find us, in addition to Twitter, on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. You can listen to us through Spotify. And if you're an Android user, you can listen through Google Play Music. But as always, you can find every single one of the podcast episodes that we've ever done, as well as reading the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog by going to the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
That's right. So we'll be back later talking about more comic goodness, but we're looking forward to seeing many of you, we hope, at HeroesCon in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's right. We'll be there, and so stop by the booth and say hi.
That's right. Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Andy. See ya.